join, and then we will go ahead and get started.
All right, the live. Yep, let's.
It says live stream.
Yep, live stream is working. I had to shorten the title for it to work, but we're good. I can edit that later. There you go. Good to go, Rebecca.
Okay. All right, yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks everybody for joining our AFO Café for March. If this is your first time, welcome. And if it's not, welcome back. So this, we originally started the AFO Cafés as sort of a way to have informal conversations about anything birds, whether it is field work related or anything that anyone feels like sharing, recent data, past data, travels, or what have you. So briefly, just if you are not already a member of AFO, just to let you know who we are, AFO focuses on studying and conserving birds in their natural habitats. And one of the things that we try to do is bridge that gap between professional ornithologists and amateur ornithologists, so that you don't have to, you can be a birder, you don't have to be an academic, you can be in any sort of private sector, whatever job brings you to birds or just a love of birds can bring you to AFO. What also makes us unique is our strong connection with Latin American countries in terms of not only our membership, but outreach, having joint meetings down throughout Latin and South America, as well as grant programs for both North American and South American members. So just a reminder that our meeting is quickly approaching. We're having our joint meeting this year with Wilson Ornithological Society and Society of Canadian Ornithologists. The abstract deadline was extended, and that deadline is today. So if you were planning on submitting, please get that in. Other dates to just keep in mind, early bird registration rates will be available through March 31st. And if you would like a t-shirt, which I believe the t-shirt is just light blue with this logo that you see here, you can pre-order until June 30th at the website here on this slide. In addition, field trips have been announced and planned. There's hotel info, travel info, all about where to fly in, how to get from airports to Peoria. There's a hashtag. Okay, make sure you can follow that on social media to stay up to date. Registration is open. And again, as I mentioned, there's early bird discount till May 31st. One thing that we are excited to share and announce for the first time is that we have our plenary speaker for the conference. So each of the three societies has a plenary, one of the three main days of the conference. And our plenary speaker, we are really excited to have Jen Owen from Michigan State. Most of you probably know Jen Owen for her research on infectious disease in birds. She does so much more in terms of starting up multiple banding stations and the Suisun Marsh Ecological Research Center with a large role there in Michigan. So we're excited to have her. More on what she'll be talking about as we get closer. Another thing for AFO members, we have our annual members meeting coming up on May 14th. You should have already received an email with a link to register for the meeting. If you haven't yet registered, please go back through your emails and or keep an eye on your inbox. There will be more reminders coming soon. We do hope that as many of you can join as possible. It'll be through Zoom. So once you register, you'll get that Zoom link. We're going to talk about updates to our grants program, introduce our new co-editor-in-chief of JFO, do an AVANET update, election of our new officers and counselors, and then go over some additional updates on the Peoria meeting and some beginning plans that we have for an AFO-only meeting in 2025. As part of that meeting, we will go through our business as quickly as we can, and then we are happy to have actually our communications and marketing specialist for AFO, Agustina Torretta, who will be presenting her sort of perspective on how she went from being a translator to joining the bird world through this saffron-cowled blackbird project, and then ultimately having that what led her to apply for this communications and marketing position we had at AFO. So that'll be our highlighted speaker during that membership meeting. The AFO cafes are sponsored by Avian. So Avian Research Supplier is a business venture with AFO. So any of your bird field supplies, mist netting, bat mist netting, field guides, field notebook needs, please visit avinet.com to pick those up. And we thank them for supporting our speakers that we invite for this project, for this cafe. Okay, that was all of the news that I have to share. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's speaker. Okay, Dr. Shannon Skalos. She is the statewide avian conservation coordinator for California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And she has many, many years of experience working with wild birds, and in particular raptors. She's getting more into setting up baiting stations and songbird work, but she's going to share with us a lot of the work that she was doing during her dissertation research. So Shannon, I am going to stop sharing my screen and let you share yours.
All right. Let's get mine. Let me swap my screen again. All right, how does that look?
Looks great.
Okay. Gonna hide this little window somewhere so it's not blocking everything. All right. All right, thanks. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, AFO and Avinet, for having me. I'm happy to be here. So like Rebecca said, I'm Shannon Skalos, Statewide Avian Conservation Coordinator for California Department of Fish and Wildlife. But when I was doing this research on harriers, I was a wildlife biologist for the USGS, the Western Ecological Research Center here in Dixon, California. And I was also simultaneously doing my PhD at UC Davis in the ecology grad group. So I'm going to talk to you about all things harriers. I like to talk a lot, so I'm just going to jump right in. That's kind of my style. And hopefully I can convey to you why harriers are so wonderful and why they're worth studying and conserving. Okay, so first I like to start with Suisun Marsh for two reasons. One, it's difficult for people to pronounce, and a lot of people don't know where it is. But two, it's also, as you can see from this beautiful mural, a very diverse an important ecological system here in California. So Suisun is named after the Suisunese people, who are a Patwin tribe of the Winton Native Americans. They lived in this region for thousands of years and still do. And Suisun means people of the west wind. And it definitely lives up to that name. It is windy in Suisun every day of the year, 365 days of the year. So it's a very windy location, and that makes it both wonderful in the really hot summers of the California, the really hot valley in the California summers, but also a little challenging when you're trying to do bird netting and trapping and surveys and things as well. As you can see, again, from this mural, a diverse array of wildlife and organisms call Suisun Marsh home. Prominently featured is the Northern Harrier that you can see right here. But the other kind of wetland and grassland specialist or adapted raptor that also occurs in Suisun is the short-eared owl, which I put over here. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but here we go. Here's the short-eared owl, not featured in this mural, so I like to add it. And of course, our Northern Harrier. There are two wetland and grassland raptor species that occur here in Suisun Marsh. But of course, Suisun is home to a variety of very unique and sensitive and even listed species like salt marsh harvest mice, Delta smelt, sturgeon, western pond turtles, a variety of different species that are really important and call Suisun Marsh home. For harriers, Suisun was once considered and may still be the largest breeding population or area for breeding harriers in California and possibly in the West Coast. but we know over the past several decades that their populations have been in decline, likely due to habitat loss, habitat changes, and prey availability, which we'll get into in this talk as well. And just to kind of give you an example of this change just in Suisun Marsh, back in the 1990s, when California Waterfowl Association was doing a lot of waterfowl nest searching and monitoring in Suisun Marsh, they found a high of 72 harrier nests in an area of 1,300 acres. That was actually a really high number. Normally, this would be more like 25 or 30 nests, but point is, there were years that there were a lot of harrier nests in a very small area. Fast forward to my research, and most of it took place on the Grizzly Island Wildlife Area, which is 13,000 acres, so 10 times that size. And I would find anywhere from 15 to 20 nests per year. So a very large drop in the number of nests and the breeding population in Suisun just since the 1990s. So it's important to figure out what is going on with harriers and why they're in decline. If you're not familiar with Suisun, here is a picture of it right here in the middle, located in this yellow square. And if you're not familiar with this region of the country or of North America, here's Sacramento and here's San Francisco. So it's kind of right in between those two major cities up here in Northern California, right at the bottom of the Sacramento Valley. It is the largest remaining brackish water marsh on the west coast of North America, and it is part of the larger San Francisco Bay Delta that we see right here. San Francisco Bay here, San Pablo Bay, Suisun is here, and then we go out into the Delta here. It's also right at the confluence of the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers that drains right into the marsh. And if we zoom into Suisun, you see all of that darker green on your screen. That is primarily the managed marsh that is existing on Suisun now. So managed marshes are marshes that are leveed or are diked and have water control structures so that landowners can control and manipulate the water levels to manipulate the vegetation that grows on the landscape and what's available for different wildlife. And in this case, it's primarily managed for waterfowl. But we also have some tidal marsh, some remnant tidal marsh left out here in these islands along the edges of the levees, and then a big extant tidal marsh section right here in Rush Ranch. And it's really beautiful. If you haven't been out there, I encourage you to go out and see it. Then we have some upland habitat or grassland habitat. Some of that is primarily on the Grizzly Island Wildlife Area and then scattered about throughout the marsh. And then surrounding Suisun, there's a lot of pasture and some agricultural land where it's grazed by cattle, sheep, and then there's ag like alfalfa and wheat that are grown just on the outskirts of Suisun Marsh. All right, so now that we understand Suisun a little bit, let's talk about harriers and get to know them a little bit more. So first and foremost, I always like to say they're a new species. I probably really can't say that anymore because this is getting to be about 10 years old since they were split from the hen harrier and elevated to their own species. So they're really not a new species anymore, but I used to like to claim that when I was doing my dissertation research. In reality, what is exciting about harriers is that there are only North American harrier species. There are about 16 other harrier species that occur elsewhere in the world, and many other continents have several species of harrier. We only have the Northern Harrier. They were once considered part of the same species of hen harrier, the Eurasian species, but we now know that they're more closely related to the cinereous harrier, which is the South American species. They're polygynous in the breeding season, so most of the pairs are going to be monogamous, this one male to one female pair, but there are a small portion of the breeding populations, maybe 10 to 15%, depending on the small mammal population that year, that will exhibit polygyny with a male to at least 2 females, sometimes more females, depending on, like I said, the year and the small mammal population. They're also sexually dimorphic in both size and plumage. This is actually really exciting because we don't have a lot of plumage dimorphic raptor species in North America. Size dimorphism is pretty common. Females are typically larger than males. But for this very drastic plumage dimorphism, harriers are fairly unique. The female there on the bottom being brown on top and then heavily marked brown underneath. And then, of course, the males everybody is familiar with. They're called the gray ghost, white underneath, gray on top. And they both have that characteristic white rump patch. The only other raptor species in North America that's really obviously dimorphic in plumage would be the American kestrel. There are other species, of course, that have plumage dimorphism, but it's a lot more subtle. And harriers kind of, I think, take the cake when it comes to really obvious plumage dimorphism. And they are also a secretive wetland and grassland specialist, or wetland and grassland adapted raptor species. And as such, they nest on the ground. These landscapes, these habitat types typically are devoid of trees or perches. So these birds have adapted to being largely on the ground. And they like to nest in tall, dense vegetation for the most part. Here's an example. This is me. I'm 5'10", and I'm walking into a harrier nest site here. And you can see this cattail vegetation is well over my head. So some of their nest sites can actually be have really tall vegetation and be very dense. Once you get into the nest site, this is what it looks like. So their nest is placed either directly on the ground, or if it's in a tidal marsh, they tend to elevate it up a bit on some substrate, on a little bit of a platform, to keep it away from the tide when it's high tide. And it's usually surrounded by a lot of dead residual vegetation from the previous year, and then some live vegetation from the current growing season that provides some of that density and cover around the nest higher up. All right, so why study harriers? Well, raptors in general are considered indicators of ecosystem health, and they can often serve as umbrella or flagship species for ecosystem protection. So in places like Suisun Marsh, where we have a lot of sensitive species and it's a really sensitive ecosystem, understanding what's going on with some top predators and applying some management and conservation strategies and practices that benefit them could potentially benefit other species in the ecosystem as well. They're also a species of special concern in California. That basically means they're on a special watch list. They're not listed on our state endangered species list, but it means that we understand their populations are in decline and that they could potentially be listed in the future. We know that their breeding populations are in decline, mostly through waterfowl nest monitoring research that's taken place across the state that incidentally find harrier nests, but there haven't been a lot of targeted harrier studies. And we also don't know a whole lot about their migration and wintering ecology or their habitat selection. We know some general things about their habitat selection and their ecology from other studies in other parts of the North America, but on the West Coast and in the Pacific Flyway specifically, we really don't have a lot of information on harriers. All right, and I always like to share a couple of interesting behaviors and cool behaviors about harriers. They exhibit this behavior called sky dancing when they are doing their courtship displays early in the breeding season. It's typically a behavior that is associated with males. So they'll display this sky dance where they fly up in the sky. They do a lot of loops and undulations and flips and twirls while calling to attract a female to their territory and to hopefully breed with her. But what a lot of people don't realize is that female harriers perform sky dances as well, both in the beginning of the breeding season and then throughout the breeding season. So oftentimes, once the female has mated and is incubating her eggs, she won't leave the nest and she won't hunt for herself throughout most of that period of time through incubation and early brood rearing. So she relies almost entirely on the male to bring her food. And what we noticed in our years of studying harriers is that females in incubation and early brood rearing would get off the nest, perform the sky dance, and then not long after, her male would come in and bring her food. So it seemed to us that it was a signal she would display to her male to bring her food and say, hey, I'm sitting here on the nest all day, I'm getting hungry, could you please come in and tend to me? So here's a video that I'll show of a female doing some sky dancing, and then she lands back at her nest. And that was her nest there at the end where she landed. So you can see it's pretty, complex, lots of loops and undulations, ups and downs. She even makes some kind of quiet chattering. It's hard to hear over the screaming of the marsh wrens and the song sparrows there. But they do vocalize and talk to their mate. And then not long after that, we'll see something like this, where the male will fly in. This male has a vole in his talons. It's a decapitated vole. The female is getting up off of her nest. The male will throw the vole to her midair. She'll catch it. I've never seen them miss or drop it. I'm sure it happens occasionally, but they're really good at this. The female then typically screams with joy. She's got her food. She's ready to eat. And then they move on. The male will go about his business and continue to hunt. and the female will go off somewhere to eat, or she'll take it back to the nest to feed her nestlings, depending on what stage she's at in the nest period. All right, so now we know a little bit about Suisun and about harriers. Let's get into some of this research that we did. Let's talk about reproduction and how that's linked to small mammal populations, and that'll kind of be a good segue into my research. So we know that harrier reproductive success is linked to vole populations. We know this primarily from other studies on hen harriers, because remember, once upon a time, hen harriers and northern harriers were considered the same species. So we oftentimes considered data collected on hen harriers to be consistent with what we believed was happening with northern harriers in North America. So a lot of these data maybe are not completely applicable to northern harriers anymore, but it's what we have in our literature for northern harriers right now. But you can see from these figures, these are on hen harriers. The number of voles, the abundance of voles going up and down throughout years correlates with the number of individual harriers in the population. Same thing here, different measures of nest success, like clutch size, correlates well with higher abundance of voles. We also see things from Francis Hammerstrom's long-term research on harriers in Wisconsin, where the number of voles over time cycles and matches the number of harrier nests in the population really well. And then we also see other measures of nest success correlate to high vole years versus low vole years. So at high vole years, we see more breeders in the population versus low. We see more nests versus low vole years. We see more successful nests, etc. So we know that both hen harriers and northern harriers, at least northern harriers in Wisconsin, have their reproductive success tightly linked to vole populations. So this is really what I think harriers want, is for their mom and their dad to bring them voles. So what about in Suisun Marsh? What do they eat there? So first what we did was place nest cameras on nests throughout the study from 2017 to 2019. We identified 3,782 prey items from 23 nest cameras. That's a lot of prey items, in case you're wondering. And it was many thousands of hours of video that myself and a team of undergraduate interns watched and cataloged and categorized. If we look at this first category here on the graph, we see about 25% of the nestling diet, so these are prey items being brought back to the nest, consisted of birds. There were anything from various passerine species, cliff swallows, red-winged blackbirds, common yellowthroats, marsh wrens, meadowlarks, etc. Ducklings were on the menu as well. Remember, these harriers are nesting on the ground in and around the same habitat that a lot of waterfowl are nesting in as well. And then we'd even see bigger prey items later in the nesting season. We'd see females bringing in ringneck pheasant chicks and American bittern chicks even. Very large prey items that I was not expecting to see. Of course, small mammals were the vast majority of their nestling diet. On average, 50% of that nestling diet made up of small mammals. Things like voles, mice, rabbits, broad-footed moles, and a couple of other species as well. But for the most part, voles seem to be the most important and the preferred prey item. So of the entire nestling diet, on average, 45% was voles. And of just the small mammals, or that mammal category, almost 80% were voles. So we know from the nest camera video that voles are very important for harriers in Suisun Marsh. We also saw about 7% of the diet consist of reptiles, mostly gopher snakes and some southern alligator lizards, occasionally a racer and maybe a western fence lizard. And then a relatively high percentage were unknown. This is for various reasons. We either just couldn't tell based on quality of the video, or maybe the female had her back to the camera, or maybe the nestling took the prey off camera, so we couldn't always identify each of the provisioning events to species or even to taxa, unfortunately. All right, and what does this look like? I always like to show some videos because people like to see actual harriers doing harrier things. Here's a video of a female provisioning. She's got that's a bird that she's taking apart and provisioning to her young. And you can see how much care she takes to feed them. Takes little tiny pieces of each prey item and feeds it to each nestling. I think we calculated on average it was about 40 pieces per prey item taken apart and fed to those nestlings. So It's a lot of time in processing and feeding those young. We also captured some really tender moments too and other kinds of behavior. Here's a female that was particularly good at mothering and really liked to brood her oversized nestlings that did not need to be brooded anymore. They're settling in for the night and getting ready to go to sleep here. It's just at sunset. Then we would see things also like females bringing nest material to the nest well into the nesting season. So it's not something they just do in the beginning of the breeding season. They'll do it throughout the nesting season. This female's just dropping it off for the kids to take care of here, but we would see this throughout the nesting season where they would just continuously maintain and upkeep their nests. And then occasionally we would see dad come to the nest and do that too. Dad was much less common. They often don't come to or land at the nest, so it was really a treat when a male would come and land to the nest. And the chicks are saying, "Who are you?" because they never see their dad. All right, so now we know what they eat. Next, we need to understand what is actually available on the landscape. And since we know that small mammals are really important and that we believe that voles are probably important too, we decided to do some small mammal trapping, or smammal trapping as it's lovingly called. We trapped in the spring and the summer, so both before and after the breeding seasons on all 3 years, across different habitat types in Suisun Marsh. And we captured 1,300 individuals across 1,900 total captures. So we had a lot of recaptures. That's a lot of mice. And only 28 of them were voles. So that was not good. And that was kind of surprising and a little bit of a red flag for us. So what's going on with voles? Why are we not catching voles? We did the same exact thing that other researchers did, other people who studied small mammals were doing currently in the marsh and had done decades before. Another study caught hundreds of voles in the same exact fields that we were trapping in. So something was going on and we were not catching voles, and we don't know why. Vole populations seem to be low. Harvest mice that you see here on the left were our most common species, both western and salt marsh harvest mice, followed by house mice, and then followed by voles. We then were able to estimate density and abundance using open spatial capture-recapture models. We did this for house mice, harvest mice, and then all small mammals combined. You'll see that we were not able to do this for voles because we did not have enough captures for estimation. And we decided to go with all small mammals as kind of our proxy for voles. It's not ideal, but we had some justification, some evidence to do this. If we look at just our raw captures, we saw more house mice, more harvest mice, and even more voles slightly in 2018 than 2017 and 2019. And all of those species seem to follow the same trend. Additionally, if we break down our camera provisioning data that I was showing on a previous slide by year, you can see in 2017, when all the small mammals peaked, this is also when we saw more small mammals and more voles in the nestling diet. Almost 70% of the nestling diet that year consisted of small mammals, and primarily these were voles. All right, so now we know what they eat. Now we know how much food is available on the landscape in terms of small mammals. We wanted to also then combine this with various habitat characteristics that we measured at different spatial scales to help us understand a little bit about nest site selection and then later nest success. So we did various vegetation measurements on the ground. That's the microhabitat scale in and around the nest site. We also took a variety of measurements at the macrohabitat scale. These are mostly distances to different landscape scale features, as well as distance to different harrier nests. We incorporated small mammal density into these models as well. And then we did a home range scale analysis where we looked at probability of use of different land cover classes at the home range scale as well. We did this with conditional logistic regression models, and the home ranges were calculated with Brownian bridge movement models. All right, so what did we find? In our microhabitat analysis, we found that overall nest site selection is informed by average vegetation height, about 80 to 100 centimeters, presence of California rose, though that model has a lot of uncertainty in it, as you can see with those confidence intervals, and a higher proportion of emergent vegetation. So this proportion of terrestrial vegetation means the opposite of that was emergent vegetation. So more emergent vegetation had higher probability of selection. And I'll put all of this together in a concluding slide and talk about what it means in a couple of slides. At our macrohabitat scale, we saw a preference for or a selection for nest sites at a distance from water about 100 meters, 120 meters or so. avoidance of unnestable vegetation, things like shrubs and trees, and a selection for nest sites closer to other harrier nests. So the closer they were to other harrier nests, the more likely those nest sites were to be selected rather than further away. This makes sense. Harriers are considered to be a semi-colonial nesting species, and it may also be tied to the polygyny that I was talking about earlier in the presentation. So in years where males can have more than one female, those females are likely to be close to one another and in the same territory of that male. And then at the home range scale, we looked at home ranges for 10 adult females. These females were equipped with transmitters, and we found a significant selection for wetland habitat throughout the nesting season. So even though you can see these territories are distributed all across Suisun, wetland habitat was by far and large the largest habitat type used within the entire breeding season relative to other habitat types or land cover classes. Okay, so what does this all mean? Here's my visual representation of these results, because I'm a visual learner and I like to see things like this. So we've got our hypothetical field, our managed marsh field here with our kind of colony and cluster of harrier nests. We know that harriers tend to like taller vegetation that's slightly more emergent than we see terrestrial vegetation. There is some proximity or amount of rows in and around those nest sites, with some preferred distance from water, and then further distance away from any kind of shrubs or trees or taller vegetation. And how I interpret all of these characteristics at their nest sites and for selection is that these are likely adaptations for predator avoidance and concealment of the nest, right? If your nest has a lot of tall vegetation, it has rows, which is difficult to get through, it has water on the landscape, and it's further away from things like trees and shrubs where these predators like to hang out and live, you might have a better chance of potentially having higher nest success. So that is what we'll get to next. Surprisingly, remember the small mammals I talked about early on? Small mammals did not seem to affect nest site selection, but it's possible that voles do in fact inform selection. We just didn't have enough voles in our study to actually estimate vole abundance, and maybe using the small mammals as a proxy is not appropriate. So it's not entirely clear if that's true or not. Okay, next we're going to talk about nest success. So how do we go from selecting a nest site, laying our eggs, and having chicks to getting them up to this fluffy dinosaur stage right here, and then successfully fledging them off into the wild? We did similar, we used similar covariates and similar analysis to what we did in the nest site selection study, micro and macro habitat vegetation characteristics using small mammal density, and then the addition of some nest timing variables, things like nest age, nest initiation, that can help us determine or understand if there are sensitive periods in the nesting season that influence success. And I used logistic exposure models here, which are a slight improvement over Mayfield models for calculating nest success and nest survival. So what did we find? In our microhabitat analysis, we found that short residual vegetation and a higher percentage of live vegetation seems to increase probability of nest survival or nest success. Residual vegetation, remember, is kind of that dead brown vegetation that tends to accumulate on the ground year after year in these kinds of complex fields where these harriers are nesting. They probably provide substrate for the nest and then a little bit of nest concealment and structure around the base. And then live vegetation is the vegetation that's going to be taller, kind of concealing the nest that year, and is the vegetation that's growing in that growing season. At the macro habitat scale, we found that proximity to rows, higher spring small mammal density, and whether the nest is placed in a managed marsh increases probability of survival. Rows makes sense because we just talked about that in the previous nest site selection analysis. Small mammals in the spring seem to increase nest survival, meaning small mammals early in the nesting season may be able to predict survival of those nests. And then being in a managed marsh versus a tidal marsh or an upland field seem to have a strong influence on nest survival as well. And then we did some additional analysis looking at the effect of small mammals on other metrics of nest success, things like number of fledglings, clutch size, number of nestlings, etc. And what we found is that summer small mammal density had a relationship with the number of fledglings. So higher summer small mammal density seemed to increase the number of fledglings that year. I would point out too that this is also, we were able to make estimates of small mammal density at different scales. The 1 kilometer squared scale is the female core use area from our telemetry data. We also estimated this for what we would think a male scale would be at 5 kilometers squared, but we don't have any good data on male home range size, so that was largely a guess. We need more information on males to be able to test that more accurately. All right, so we're back to our visual representation of what this all means. We've got our hypothetical harrier cluster on the landscape in a managed marsh far away from shrubs and trees. We've got nests that have a lot of short residual vegetation and more live vegetation, resulting in higher nest success. We've got nests that have more rows or are closer to rows, resulting in more nest success. And again, all of these things make sense with nest site selection. Just like with nest success, they are likely adaptations to concealing the nest and preventing predation from the predators on the landscape. We also see that spring small mammal density leads to increased nest success overall. And for those successful nests, summer small mammal density leads to more fledglings than in those successful nests, excuse me. And interestingly, we didn't see any effect of timing variables on nest success. So there didn't seem to be any particular sensitive period in the nesting season that influenced survival. All right, so last but not least, we're going to move on to migration and talking a little bit about the migration ecology of these harriers. So we're switching a little bit now from the breeding birds, the resident breeding population in Suisun, and now we're going to look at the migratory wintering birds, the birds that are coming into Suisun in the winter that are not there during the breeding season in the summer. So we wanted to determine migration timing, routes, stopover areas for these migratory birds that winter in Suisun Marsh, also determine their breeding locations, habitat selection across their annual cycle. Does it match up with what we're seeing birds in Suisun breeding? And look at some differences between short and long distance migrants, because as you'll see in a minute, we had some short and long distance migrants in the population. And this slide is a little misleading, even though I'm showing you a male. All of this research is coming from adult females. At the time of the study, the units, the transmitters that I was using were too large for adult males, so we could only use females in this study. And we used these two units here, the Ecotone and the Ornatella GPS GSM units. All right, and what did we find? If we first look at this figure here, and I apologize, I know it's a little bit small. If we look at spring departure and spring arrival. So this is departure from Suisun Marsh and then arrival at their breeding grounds, wherever that may be outside of Suisun Marsh. We see the median departure and arrival dates are only 3 days apart. So spring migration seems to be very, very short and very fast. For fall departure, so leaving their breeding grounds, and then fall arrival, meaning arriving back at the wintering area, mostly Suisun Marsh, we see a much longer and more protracted migration, 3 months apart, or 2 months apart, excuse me, in that migration timing. So slower, more protracted fall migration and a faster, shorter spring migration. What does that look like on an annual cycle? Here we show the range of dates that harriers left Suisun Marsh in their spring migration to reach their breeding grounds, anywhere from February 22nd all the way to May 23rd. And that range likely represents differences between short and long distance migrants. Longer distance migrants tended to leave earlier than shorter distance migrants. And then a much longer protracted period of time for fall migration. So they could leave anywhere from June 2nd all the way to December 5th was the latest we saw an individual leave their breeding ground to come back to their wintering location. All right, here's a giant wall of text. I do not want you to read this graph. There's a lot going on, or this table, there's a lot going on here. I'm going to summarize it for you, but these are the different migration metrics that we calculated: migration distance, duration, stopover duration, and migration speed. So first, you'll notice that fall migration was a lot farther than spring. So here's our average fall migration, about 2,900 kilometers versus 2,100 kilometers for spring. We see fall migration lasts 2.5 times longer than spring, so 30 days versus 12 days on average. Fall stopovers were 3.5 times longer than spring, so they could spend up to 25 days on average versus 7 days at stopover locations during their migration. And then spring migration, as a result, was much faster than fall. It was faster than fall by 60 kilometers per day on average. So on average, they were traveling about 130 kilometers per day in fall migration versus almost 200 kilometers in spring migration. So just like we saw on the previous slide, fall migration was much slower and more protracted than spring migration, which makes sense. Birds oftentimes are getting to their getting to their breeding grounds much quicker to be able to set up territories and start breeding early. All right, and then we broke this down a little bit by short distance and long distance migrants. So in my data set, there were a variety of birds that would only migrate, maybe 1,000 kilometers or so and would stay relatively close to Suisun, versus other birds that would migrate further than 1,500 kilometers. And in the raptor migration literature, oftentimes long distance migrants are considered birds that migrate longer than 1,500 kilometers. So a little over half of the birds in this study, there were 14 birds that had usable data, were considered short distance migrants, an average total migration of about 1,100 kilometers for these individuals. Stopover and breeding locations largely were on state wildlife areas, federal refuges, remote wilderness areas, and some rural agricultural areas. And this is important because a lot of those wildlife areas and refuges and wilderness areas actually contained wetland and marsh habitat similar to what we saw in Suisun Marsh. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. There was some overlap in stopover locations as well. So if you look right here, I'm sorry, this is small, but the little gray circle with the X through it, here, 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 and even up here, these are stopover locations that multiple individuals shared, or that one individual would use in both of its migrations in fall and spring. So we're identifying some important stopover locations. And these migration routes typically took them through kind of central and eastern California and then up through eastern Oregon and eastern Washington. And these birds bred anywhere from just northern California into Oregon. And then we had one individual that went all the way over to Idaho. This is not an actual migratory path. The transmitter did not work. It was here and then it was here. So that line is not real. But the point is, one individual made it to Idaho. I don't exactly know how they got there, but they got there. And then importantly, all of these birds return to Suisun Marsh in the winter. So that's really exciting information. Another thing I'd like to point out here is that a lot of times harriers are not counted or represented well at hawkwatch stations and at banding stations in the West. So this map is showing you all of the Hawkwatch International hawkwatch stations throughout the West. And the yellow line is showing you kind of the average migratory route for the harriers in this study. And you can see that Bonnie Butte and Chelan Ridge, these two locations here, are well outside of the primary migratory routes for harriers. So they're really being missed by a lot of these hawkwatch sites. And then the important stopover locations that we identified here are also, not being picked up by hawkwatch stations. So identifying these locations with the telemetry data could help us identify places in the landscape where we can better monitor migration and possibly, better population monitoring for harriers in the West. All right, what about our long distance migrants? So for long distance migrants, a little less than half of them were considered long distance. We recorded the longest round trip migration for any harrier among two of these birds, ranging anywhere from 13,000 to 20,000 kilometers. And you're seeing that on the map here. This female, Blanca, she was our champion migratory female. She's the blue and the orange up here, where she went up to the North Slope of Alaska and bred 2 times, 1 year apart. And I'll show you her migration on this video. So this is a movement video of her migration route. So the blue is her 2018 migration in spring. And then in a second, you're going to see red pop up in her 2019 migration. So you'll see both of those simultaneously side by side. And kind of notice that even though her timing is much different across the years, she stops in a lot of the same locations. And then she ends up getting to her breeding location, which those two locations are very close to one another around the same time as well. This video is a little bit long, but we're just going to let it play out. In 2018, she took a more coastal route to get to her breeding site. And in 2019, she took an inland route. But for the most part, right around late May, she arrived at her breeding grounds for both years. Then we have a long period of time where we're just going to sit here because she's incubating and she's raising her young, and the scale is too large for you to actually see any of her daily movements and activity that's happening here. In 2018, her nesting season was cut a little short, so we don't know if she was necessarily successful or if her nest failed, because you'll see here in about a month, around 4th of July, she leaves. But in 2019, she stays a lot longer. So she may have been successful in 2019 and unsuccessful in 2018. All right, she should be leaving here soon. Here we go. Starts moving around, leaving her nest site, kind of hangs out in the area for a while, probably refueling, getting ready for her migration. And then she'll start making her way back south, back to Suisun. Okay, here she goes. And she takes a more inland route this time on her way south. And every time you see kind of a pause, that's a day. So these are all diurnal movements. There's no nocturnal movements. They stop and they sleep each night. And when she stops like that, that's a stopover location where she's spending several days. So she goes back down to the same area where she stopped on her way north during spring migration. You see in 2019, she's still there. And now she's finally leaving. She's a lot faster in her migration home in 2019. She makes fewer stops. But she does come down to around the same area again, stops for a day or two, and then makes her way back down into Suisun Marsh. And now she's back. And it takes her a lot longer. She hangs out here for a long time before she actually comes back down to Suisun in 2018. So I won't show all that right now if I can stop it. All right, I may have to just let it finish out because it's not letting me end. Oh, there we go. All right, so for all of these long distance birds, migration routes were similar to the short distance birds, central and eastern sides of California, Oregon, Washington. And then once we get into British Columbia and Alaska, there was some coastal migration and some inland migration, but our sample size is a lot smaller for these birds, so it's harder to make generalizations about routes for birds that went up into Alaska. I will say there were other birds than these two that went to Alaska and bred, but their transmitters either failed at some point along the way or they did not return, and so we didn't have any return data to say exactly where they bred. Breeding areas for long distance migrants were Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. And again, all of the birds returned, or at least the birds that had working transmitters returned to Suisun Marsh. Okay, now I'm going to show you just some really quick and dirty habitat selection for these migratory birds. I have a more sophisticated analysis that I'm working on, but this is what I'm going to show you today. Just some quick manley selection ratios to look at habitat selection based on those different land cover classes for these migratory individuals. So anything that's above the horizontal line would be selection, and anything below would be avoidance. So for the nest sites for all of these migratory birds, they had a strong selection for wetland habitat. And this is consistent with what we saw with breeding individuals in Suisun Marsh as well. For spring and for fall stopover sites, we see some selection for grassland, shrubland, and wetland habitat. There's a lot of uncertainty in these results because our sample size is a lot smaller. And then in our winter sites, which are primarily Suisun or just outside of Suisun, we see selection for cultivated lands and for wetlands. The cultivated lands are primarily wheat habitat and alfalfa, and then wetland habitat within Suisun Marsh itself. Okay, so what does all of this mean? If there's one thing that you take away from this entire talk, it's that voles are really important, and we need to understand what's going on with voles. I think I started this talk by saying if we help harriers, maybe that'll help everything below them in the ecosystem. But I also think that if we figure out what's going on with voles, that'll help everything going on in the ecosystem as well. I didn't talk about it here, but there's some other data from Suisun that shows that the population or the abundance of voles is also linked to reproductive success in waterfowl. And that likely is a result of mesocarnivores like skunks and raccoons eating more abundant prey like voles, and that alleviating some of that pressure on waterfowl nests, leading to higher success for them. So voles are probably important for many, many things out in the landscape, not just harriers. So if we figure out what's going on with them, we can probably help manage and conserve this ecosystem. We also found, of course, that tall residual vegetation, proximity to rows and water, proximity to other harrier nests, avoidance of shrubs and trees are all important features in nest site selection and in success for harriers in Suisun. Things like minimizing the disturbance to this habitat, so reducing mowing and disking and burning and those kinds of management practices to allow for tall, complex vegetation to grow can provide a lot of structure for these nests and potentially increase the number of breeding birds in the landscape. Bonus, this is also good for voles. They like this kind of management as well. We found out that Suisun is really important across metapopulations of harriers that are both wintering and resident birds across the annual cycle. We found that migration is pretty reliant on protected lands like national wildlife refuges and state wildlife areas, particularly those that have wetland and grassland habitat. So wetland habitat is not just important for breeding sites and for wintering sites, it's important as stopover locations as well across the migration path. We also think that maybe some targeted locations for migration monitoring stations are needed for harriers because we're really missing them. We're not capturing them at the established hawk migration sites that are on the landscape right now. And then last but not least, I have to say that males and juveniles are kind of the missing link to this work. All of the data are primarily based on adult females. And so if we can understand what's going on with males with smaller transmitters that are now available and can be placed on males, as well as juvenile dispersal and survival from both the breeding and the wintering birds, that can really help us complete the picture of what's going on with harrier populations in California, in the West, and how we can conserve and manage this species. All right, really quickly, I just want to say thank you to everybody who made this possible. There were many, many people, lots of organizations, agencies that helped with this, made it possible, funded it, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you to all those people. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thanks so much, Shannon. That was super interesting. Yeah, no, I learned a lot. Oh, I see the little harrier there. Your picture. So yeah, we are happy to open it up to questions. You can unmute yourself to ask a question. That's probably the easiest way to go about it, or you could always type it into the chat box and I can read it. But again, I'm happy to open it up to whoever has questions.
Hi, Dan.
I've got a question, Shannon. That was a really awesome presentation. And it's not a subject of your research per se, but at the end when you said males are kind of the missing link, sort of thinking of something else that I'm not sure if we know a ton about with males. Like, you mentioned harriers are, apart from kestrels, like the only really dramatically dichromatic raptor. And like it seems like people know a little bit about the function of the sky dance in terms of sexual selection, right? Females are really paying attention to it, and there's some variation in how well males do it and things.
Right.
I was just curious, do you know anything about the plumage side of things in terms of sexual selection? Has anybody looked at variation in male plumage, if there are aspects of it that females pay attention to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. There may have been studies on it, but I'm not actually sure. It wasn't really part of my research, so it wasn't something I focused on too much. But yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good question. Yeah. I don't have an answer for you, Dan.
It just it makes me want to I don't know, maybe you and I can team up. We can work on it. Our males hard to trap. But it was the other thing I was going to ask you about. The female bias in the data is partly due to the tags being too big for males, right? But do you have to trap the females at the nest, and are the males harder to get your hands on?
Yeah, and what I didn't present here, a whole other chapter of my dissertation was developing trapping techniques for wintering and breeding harriers because they're hard to trap. And a lot of the traditional methods used in other populations didn't work in my population. So yes, males are harder to catch for a couple of reasons. In the breeding season, females are easier to catch at the nest, and they're spending a lot more time at the nest. So it's easier to trap them while they're, brooding or feeding their young. The males almost never come to the nest or land at the nest, so it's pretty difficult to catch them there. In the winter, at least in Suisun, there seems to be what I think is going on is some niche partitioning between the sexes in the winter period. In Suisun Marsh, it's like almost entirely females and juveniles. The males are kind of gone, they disappear. And anecdotally from friends and other people that are out in other habitat types like vineyards and agriculture just outside of the marsh, they see lots of males out there. So I think that there's something there to it as well. And because I was trapping mostly in Suisun, females are what was largely there and available. That being said, we did catch some males and we did deploy transmitters on 2 males. They're just not part of the study because it wasn't a big enough sample size to include them. Yeah. But we could try to catch males. I mean, we just have to find a good population of males.
I got a question.
Lucifer has a question.
Shannon, do you have any reason to suspect that the male's migratory behavior is different from either other studies of harriers or just you're thinking about their biology?
Yeah. And that's another reason I'd like to tag them and monitor their migration as well, because we do know from other raptor populations and from other harriers that there's probably things like timing that are going to be different, when the males leave versus when the females leave, when they arrive in the breeding grounds versus when the females arrive, that have to do with establishing territories for the breeding season. But then again, like I just mentioned, we anecdotally noticed that males were kind of absent from the landscape in the wetland habitats in the winter. And so where are they going in the winter? And are they using different habitat types? And does that, is that reflected in their migration and their migration timing? So yeah, I do suspect that there are some differences and we could learn a lot more by getting that complete picture from males. Same with juveniles. I didn't add it here, but I did tag a variety, maybe like 10, I can't remember now, 15 or 20 juveniles we marked as well, just to get some information about dispersal and where they go and things like that. I just didn't have time to put it in this presentation, but we do have some information on juveniles, and that includes both males and females.
Other questions for Shannon?
See my dad driving in the car there.
Oh.
Hi,
I'm
Dad.
listening.
Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank Shannon very much for talking with us about this. It's been a while since we've had a raptor talk, so that was really enjoyable. Really appreciate it. This is likely our last AFO Café for a bit. Most folks are sort of starting to, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, transition into field season. And so we are happy to sort of leave on this note. We really look forward to seeing as many of you as possible at our meeting in Peoria this summer. Don't forget to check your email for the members meeting info. And thanks for attending.